Now, I'm delighted to be joined by the vaccines expert, Professor Robin Shattock from Imperial College London. Robin, I don't know if you just heard my interview with Kwasi Kwarteng, in which he raised the possibility that if they can't get enough supplies of the Pfizer vaccine for the second doses, that they might give the Oxford vaccine to some people who've had the Pfizer one as a first dose. I just wonder what you thought of that.
Well, the current advice is that should only happen under, extreme situations and shouldn't be something that's recommended to be done regularly. And the reason for that is we don't have any information as to how those two vaccines will work together. Right. It's quite likely that they may work well, but in the absence of that information, it's not recommended, and we don't have evidence to support that.
Now, you're doing a lot of work at the moment on something that's on all our minds, which is the risk of a mutation, a new strain that the vaccines don't work on. How would you quantify the magnitude of one of those mutations turning up, I don't know, in the next few months?
I mean, right now, the mutations that we've seen haven't escaped the pressure of the vaccine, so that's good news. It's certainly a potential risk that it may occur at some point. What I think is unlikely that we'll go from vaccines working to them not working at all. Yeah. We may see a gradual reduction in their efficacy if there are changes in the virus that we would see once enough people had had the vaccine to provide a pressure for selecting those mutations.
Now, I was encouraged to see that you're, I think, devoting pretty much all your time now to looking at how a vaccine could be adapted to cope with mutations. In practice, if we were to get mutations where we do need to modify vaccines or get new vaccines, how fast could that happen?
It can happen quite quickly, particularly for the mRNA-based vaccines, because it's just a question of changing the genetic code and manufacturing new lots. And what we anticipate, we won't know till we get there, is that the regulators would look at that in a pretty friendly way, in that it would be a minor change to the vaccine. So they wouldn't have to go back and do the efficacy trials. It would be more just an update of the vaccine to improve it against any mutations that might arise.
And just to be clear, when you say quite quickly, I mean, by all standards of British history, the way that we did these vaccines was quick. But are we just talking about a few months or a few weeks? What are we talking about?
We're talking about a few months here, not a period of many months. A few months it could be done in.
3 or 4?
Yes.
Something like that. Great. Listen, I've got tons more I want to put to you, so please don't go away. And you at home, if you also stick with us, so much more to discuss with Robin Shattock on vaccines and also the Chief Rabbi. All of that after the break. Welcome back. I'm delighted that the vaccines expert from Imperial College, Robin Shattock, is still with us. Robin, if I could just ask you, when I've talked to others in your field, they say that when we get mutations, some may be less amenable to the current vaccines. They think it's more likely that they'll change to become more transmissible, more infectious, rather than deadlier. Is that a reasonable assessment?
I think that's a good guess, but we don't have the data to support that. We do know that generally viruses do tend to become more transmissible and less pathogenic over time. But it's not appropriate to do a crystal ball approach to this. We really just need to look and study and watch this virus very carefully to see what it does next.
Now, one of the things that people like Chris Whitty say, and I assume you agree, is that coronavirus is going to be with us forever. If we are moving into a world where we may have to have vaccines, we may have to be vaccinated more or less every year as new strains emerge, do you think our life does get back to normal and we sort of treat it like flu? Or is there something so different between this kind of illness, this virus, and flu, that actually we may have to think about just changing some of our patterns of life, possibly wearing masks in, you know, indoor situations more often than we would ever have done in the past. Maybe restaurants have to have more gaps between tables and pubs. I'm really trying to assess whether you think there'll be permanent changes of that sort.
I think we don't know, but what is important to recognise with this virus is it came to the world where nobody had any pre-existing immunity. So we know for influenza, although it changes, some of the immune response against previous strains actually give you a bit of an edge against anything that comes along in the next season. Right. So if coronavirus changes in a year's time, most of the world's population will either have been vaccinated and have seen this virus, and that will create a very different picture. But I do think it's very likely we'll see that we'll need to give annual boosters, particularly to the vulnerable populations.
But you think it's possible that life can return to something that feels really quite normal, so densely packed concerts and pubs, that kind of thing?
I think it's certainly possible, and that's what everybody is hoping will be the case. You know, we may see that we need to resort to masks again sometime in the future if we see new pandemics. I think we're seeing cycles of pandemics coming. This is probably not the last one, and we need to, you know, each time it happens, we need to be better prepared for the future.
Now, one of the things that this government has done differently from other governments is they've widened the gap between the first and second doses to 3 months. You've given a bit of thought to this. In the end, do you think it is worth the risk of not following, essentially, what the drug companies themselves have prescribed?
I think it's another unknown. So the government has taken, you know, a position on this, but I think we need to be transparent about what we know and what we don't know. And there are two aspects. One is, you know, is that second boost going to be as good with a longer gap? Well, we have evidence for the AstraZeneca vaccine that a longer gap actually makes that second dose more effective. We don't have evidence for Pfizer and for Moderna when it comes, but everything we know about immunology would suggest actually it will be just as effective and maybe more. The bigger question is that period, that gap between the first dose and the second dose. And a lot has been said about that. And a lot of figures bandied around. But essentially, we only have data up to about 28 days for the Moderna vaccine. And it's an assumption as to how well it will work in that period from 28 days to 12 weeks. I think the person who's been most honest about this is Chris Whitty, who said that if it improves or reduces hospitalization by more than 50%, then it's a win-win scenario. But it's really, to some extent, an experiment in real time. We won't know whether it's working or not until we get the data, and by then it'll be too late to change the direction.
But it sounds to me, although you say there are risks, that you do, you know, in your bones think it's a risk worth taking.
I think the most important thing is for everybody to remember that having a single vaccine only gives you partial protection. And so people need to behave as if they have no protection until they get that second vaccine, and they will still be very potentially, you know, infectious because they may still get the infection, have mild disease or no symptoms at all, and be able to pass it on to others.
Robin, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope you'll come back soon. So